Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a short video about this, the AtGames Legends Ultimate Arcade Cabinet. I picked this cabinet up used about a year ago, and have really been enjoying my time with it. The controls feel good, and with software like CoinOps X, you can play pretty much whatever you want on this. However, there was one part that definitely needed some work, and that was the stock speakers that came with the system. These speakers are often adequate for a lot of the older games and games that originally shipped with the cabinet. However, there are times I don't find them very clear, and especially lacking in bass response. All this to say that while the cabinet may look and play the part, it often doesn't sound the part. But today, we're going to fix that. Let's get into it. The idea for this project originally came from browsing the Legends Ultimate subreddit, and several threads on other people's speaker upgrades, so I wanted to give a big shout out to everybody over there for the help, and for all the cool things they do to their own cabinets. I'll be referencing a few posts in particular throughout this video, and leaving links to them in the description if you wanted to check them out for yourself. There, you'll find that one of the more popular speaker upgrades involve these, the Kenwood KFC 835Cs. With some basic hardware and a little soldering, you can get these bigger speakers into the cabinet with ease. But we won't be stopping there, because we'll be pairing those with a small subwoofer that will sit in the bottom of the cabinet to give sounds that needed punch. For the parts list, I've broken things down into two sections, the Kenwood upgrade only and the subwoofer edition, since they can be installed independently from each other. For the Kenwood list, you will only need the speakers, some M4 screws, nuts, and washers. Optionally, you can add some black spray paint to make the hardware match the originals, or just make sure that you pick up some black screws. The cost for me to buy all of this was around $85 Canadian before tax, but if you happen to have the hardware on hand or get a good deal on the speakers, I'm sure this can be done much cheaper. For the subwoofer though, we'll need a little bit more for parts. We'll need the subwoofer, a box to put it in, an amplifier, an output converter, some good quality RCA cables, and finally some speaker wire. My total for all these items came to $167 Canadian, but once again can be done cheaper if you have things like speaker wire or RCA cables lying around. The total for both of these upgrades came to about $252 Canadian before any kind of tax or shipping. But again, this is a rough total depending on all sorts of factors as mentioned before, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what's needed to make this happen. With all that out of the way, let's first jump into the Kenwood speaker upgrade, and I'll show you how it's done. Once you have your speakers and hardware in hand, the first step to installing them is going to be to take the back of the cabinet off. There's a total of 8 Phillips screws that hold the back cover on. When taking the back cover off, be careful of the Ethernet and power cables that run back to the motherboard. These will have to be disconnected from the motherboard side to remove the cover fully, as shown here and here. With the cover removed, we can now see the back side of the speakers that we are to replace. To remove them, you first need to remove the 4 Phillips screws holding each one onto the front. After that, you can simply grab them by the cover and pull them off. Once both speakers are down, remove the 4 Phillips screws holding each speaker into their covers. Each speaker cover has a dab of glue on the back holding the wire to the cover. I used a small pair of pliers to break the glue off and to pull it down the wire to give it more slack to pull the speaker just a little bit further out. This is to give access to the solder points. A quick touch with the soldering iron melts both connections and allows us to pull the wires through the plastic cover. Now it's time to get the new speakers out and pretty much do everything in reverse. Quick comparison of the outgoing and incoming speakers. The impedance is the same, but the power rating is very different. Using our new hardware, we simply put the new speakers in. First the washer, and then hand tightening on the nut. You can see here that the speaker only attaches to the top and bottom screw. Be careful when tightening the nuts down onto the speakers, as you don't want to bend the metal tabs too far or crack any of the plastic. Even though there aren't any metal tabs on the left or right, we'll still be adding the screws just to complete the outside look. These screws were a little bit more difficult to get through the plastic, and I ended up having to thread them through with a screwdriver from the front. And lastly, we tack in the speaker wire with our soldering iron, making sure that our polarity is correct and our left-right placement is correct as well. Finally, here's how they look from the outside. Let's do some quick comparisons with the old speakers to see what kind of difference they make.
Dragon's Lair,
A fantasy adventure where you become a valiant knight on a quest
to rescue the fair princess from the clutches of an evil dragon.
You control the actions of a daring adventurer finding his way through the castle.
And so there were just a couple of examples. I understand that the audio between a YouTube video and hearing them in person would be vastly different, but I think there are a few things we can glean from these examples. The primary difference is that any digitized voice is much clearer than it was on the original speakers, and that any of the more sharp or punchy sound effects come through a lot clearer. With everything sounding clearer than ever, now we just need some low-end punch to round it all out. Which brings us nicely onto the sub edition. The first item is of course our subwoofer. And in my case, I picked up the cheapest subwoofer I could possibly find on Amazon that would be a decent size. And that ended up being this 4-ohm 200-watt subwoofer by Pyle, which we then go ahead and pair with Amazon's cheapest 8-inch subwoofer box, and install them with a little internal speaker wire to connect them up. Then using the included screws with the subwoofer to tack it into the box. In order to put the subwoofer in the bottom of the cabinet, we have to split the top part from the bottom part, starting with taking out the screws labeled S5. Then disconnecting 3 cables connecting the control panel to the CPU. From there, you should be able to lift the top off completely and give you access to the inner cavity. I opted to just place the subwoofer in the bottom of the cabinet without anything to secure it, as I don't imagine my cabinet moving around too much. But if you plan on moving your cabinet around, I would suggest some kind of bracket or weight to keep it in place. With that said, we run the speaker wire up to the top of the cabinet and put in the amplifier. For the amplifier, I once again went with one of the cheapest options I found on Amazon, with my only real requirement being that it needed a subwoofer output, which this model here calls the super bass output. And so, in order to tie this all together, we need one final piece. Our mini 2-channel line output converter. This will take the audio signal from the motherboard and convert it into an RCA output that we can then run to the amplifier. And so, after disconnecting the wires from the speakers, we do just that, twisting the appropriate wires together in order to connect the motherboard to the output converter. In this footage, I simply twisted the wires together, but I would recommend more permanent solutions like a butt connector or barrettes of some kind. Then we connect the sub up to the super bass terminals. amplifier to the converter with a pair of RCA cables. We then run new lengths of speaker wire up from the amp to each speaker. And tack them in place while I get my head in the way of the shot. With pretty much everything in place, I decided to clean things up a little bit. First, I decided to swap out the RCA cables that I had put in the cabinet. The longer, older set will be replaced by this shorter, shielded set. Next, I added some barrettes to the converter cable connections and decided to clean up my wiring while securing each piece in their final locations. Adding a few clips for cable management as well as strain relief. And drilling a small hole in the back panel for the power cord to run through. I'll admit that this wasn't the best decision, as there were many other ways you could run the power cable out, but we'll talk about this more at the end. But finally, we connect the last couple of cables back up, throw the back panel back on, and get ready to see how it all sounds. So let's roll a few examples and see if it was all worth it. Now that made a real difference. Of course, everything always sounds different in person, but I hope the details really come across here. The bass doesn't necessarily shake the cabinet, but it does round out all the music and sound effects that felt very thin before, and to me, really completes the whole package. On top of that, it also rumbles the controls just enough to make you feel like you're actually in an arcade, so overall, the sub definitely brings the entire experience up a level. And so, to wrap things up, let's talk about a few things I was alluding to before, some of the complications and some of the changes that I would make if I was to do this again. The chief one being where I decided to run the power cord for the amplifier out of the cabinet. The location and the finish looked really bad, and I would recommend trying to run the power cable out through the bottom somewhere, or internally connected to a Wi-Fi power switch. A Wi-Fi power switch that could also run the main cabinet power itself, at the same time as the amp power. Of course, a Wi-Fi power strip does add more cost and complexity than a normal one, but would be the ultimate solution if you're looking for a clean look and a simple way to turn everything on. This brings on one of the other complications, namely powering on the amp and dealing with any interference that might be present in the speakers. Because for me, every time I powered the amplifier on, I would get a pop in the speakers that would be a little bit distracting. then both the speakers and the sub would have some buzzing on first power up. This can be resolved by turning down the main volume on the amplifier and the bass volume, and then simply turning up the volume using the included buttons on the cabinet. And so finding a sweet spot between volume, bass, and treble does take a little bit of tweaking, but once you find a sweet spot for the EQ on the amp and a proper solution for the power strip, you're pretty much good to go. With my final piece of advice to be to either paint or acquire black screws as mentioned before. I opted to spray paint the screws myself to give the black screw look back, but how and if you do it yourself is up to you. If you yourself have an At Games Legends Ultimate and have done something similar before, or have any other tips to add, put it down in the comments. And so in conclusion, I'm pretty happy with how this all turned out, because to me, the cabinet really hits a sweet spot for playing and feeling similar to a real cabinet for a halfway decent price. I know there are many homebrew cabinets out there that can run things like a Raspberry Pi, but for most people like myself that aren't up to building a cabinet from scratch, this is the next best thing. And so, with all that said, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.